Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho. Tuia te muka tangata o te ropu e kohikoi ana nei. Ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Tihei mauri ora.
Kia ora, Professor Huhana Smith, for your karakia. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A warm welcome to our second session of Changing Tides, Tai Tōrua, the web series that focuses on all things moana, our precious ocean. Thank you so much for tuning in. Welcome to those of you who joined us last week, and a warm kia ora to those of you who are here for the first time. Thank you for having us in your laptops, your living rooms, and your lives. It's heartening to see how many people are actively engaged in wanting to be a part of the change. Tai Tōrua. Tai refers to the sea and the coast, also the tide, while Tōrua refers to an alteration in direction, in wind or current, and it also has connotations in weaving, to do things in twos or double strength. So the aim of Tai Tōrua, this webinar series, is to make the wisdom of experts from Aotearoa and around the world accessible, as we discuss the pressing issues facing our moana and the impacts of climate change on our marine environment. I'm your host, Elisabeth Easther, and like most New Zealanders, I've been a friend of the ocean since I was old enough to splash in the shallows. And like all of you, I've seen huge changes to that environment in my lifetime. Since making the documentary series Islands of the Gulf, I've found myself increasingly focused on conservation, learning from those whose primary focus is the preservation of our vulnerable ecosystems. It is our mutual thirst for knowledge that sees us gather here today, our passion for the ocean, and our desire to see it protected, sooner rather than later. Tai Tōrua is brought to you by WWF-New Zealand and Te Papa Atawhai, the Department of Conservation, and I would like to thank those organisations for making this series possible. And to thank all our speakers, including today's panellists, Dr. Richard Levy, Dr. Carolyn Lundquist, and Professor Huhana Smith, and all of you for joining us today. It was so heartening when the three speakers today met for the first time last week on Zoom, and all three were immediately enthused by each other, and they almost instantaneously started making plans to communicate outside of this forum, to share knowledge and move projects forward, like some sort of academic speed dating. So I know this is going to be a really positive session. This series provides opportunities for knowledge sharing and connection creation. We will open up dialogue and encourage debate, all in the name of working towards improving the health, the Māori, of our moana. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Now, before I hand to our first speaker, a few minor housekeeping matters. A chat window will be open for the first 10 minutes of this session. Can you use that facility to ask any technical questions if you're having any problems? Voting. If you see a question pop up in the Q&A situation, or the Q&As, you have the opportunity to ask questions with the little icon down the bottom of your screen. And if questions are off topic or offensive, they will be removed. And if people see a question that they like or they would like to have asked, give it a little thumbs up and it will rise to the top of the heap. And we will endeavour to ask the questions with the most votes first. Recording. All these sessions are being recorded and put on YouTube. You will find this one uploaded tomorrow on the WWF-New Zealand website, along with last week's. So if you know people who would like to have been here and couldn't, can you share it with them, please? And finally, before we begin, our kaupapa. Please be respectful in all your comments and questions. I said this last week, but I'll say it again. Please be kind and please be courteous. Right. For any other comments, do please email marine@doc.gov.nz. Today, you have joined us for our second webinar, Aotearoa, Our Changing Seas. As we all know, a healthy ocean is essential in the fight against climate change, and fighting against climate change is essential for a healthy ocean. And today we'll explore the nature of our ocean's future using insights from the past. We'll hear about global climate change trends and the impacts on our diverse marine species. And we'll also learn about an innovative approach by coastal Māori communities in the Horowhenua to plan for climate impacts. Today, our three speakers are Dr. Richard Levy, Dr. Carolyn Lundquist, and Professor Huhana Smith. First up, Dr. Richard Levy. He's Principal Scientist at GNS Science, where he leads the Environment and Climate Research team. He also leads the Antarctic Ice Dynamics Project and is an Associate Professor at the Antarctic Research Centre, part of VEW. Richard's research focuses on the evolution of Earth's climate system in the mid to high southern latitudes over the past 40 million years. In one online bio, Richard describes himself as a glacial stratigrapher and paleoclimatologist with expertise in microfossil analysis. And I used that sentence today as my vocal warm-up. Richard's talk today, Our Ocean's Future, Insights from the Past. Kia ora, Richard.
Kia ora, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. My mind is still boggling at the concept of academic speed dating. So on that note, I'll share my screen and we'll crack into it. Thanks to all of you in the audience and the webinar world for taking time out of your Alert Level 2 day to join us. And I hope I can provide today some insight or some views into what we do as geoscientists, as geologists, looking back into Earth's history to try to understand how the Earth system responded during past intervals of warmth, so that we can perhaps learn a little bit more about how it might respond in the future. So through this talk today, I'm going to touch on some intervals, some past intervals of warmth. I'm going to describe to you how we know they were slightly warmer, and we'll focus in on a couple of intervals that are very relevant for our current environment. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we can reconstruct sea surface temperatures, and perhaps some of those reconstructions might give us a little bit of a view as to where we're heading into the future. I'll then talk a little bit about primary productivity, phytoplankton, zooplankton, what we can learn from studying sediment cores about how primary productivity was different or similar under these past intervals of warmth. And then a little bit on migration from the west. And what I mean by this is, what can we learn from the fossil record that might tell us what we might expect, who we might expect to arrive from Australia in the not too distant future. And if I have time, we'll be pushing it, I know. If I have time, I'll get to talk a little bit about freshwater flux from melting ice sheets and what sort of impact that might have on our ocean system in the future. This, of course, this subject is most dear to my heart because I am an Antarctic geologist, and you can see in the background there I was lucky to take a trip a number of years ago on a voyage to the Southern Ocean on board a vessel across the Southern Ocean, and that's Mount Erebus you can see in the distance there. Right, so cracking on into it. I know you're all gasping with horror at this diagram, but bear with me. It's a pretty important piece of graph. It's a very important graph with a lot of information, but it sort of shows you why looking back into the past can be very informative about the future. What you see in this graph along the axis, the x-axis is time, going from looking into the future here from 1800 to 2300, going back in time 800,000 years, going back in time 5 million years, and then going back in time 50 million years. And then on the y-axis you have past levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And one thing to note here is that over the past 800,000 years, carbon dioxide, these are data that have been collected from ice cores that show interglacial, glacial timescales, 100,000 year timescales of past ice ages and interglacials, where CO2 didn't really climb above 300 parts per million. You have to go back 3 million years to 14 million years before you get to times when Earth last experienced carbon dioxide levels that we currently have in the atmosphere today. So if we want to understand how the Earth system behaved under CO2 conditions that we currently have and are likely to have in the future, looking at these projections here going out into the future, the RCPs, then you've got to jump back quite far in Earth's past to really understand. But today what I'm going to focus on is this interval of time here, the last 125,000 years up till present, the last interglacial, interglacial, and into our present Holocene conditions, and see what we can learn about the oceans as we study those time intervals. Right. Now, when I talk about glacials and interglacials, and I apologize if you already understand about this, but many people, when we talk about glacial intervals, they think of the movie Ice Age, and they've got a good concept of the fact that Earth once had a large ice sheet, about 20,000 years ago, had a large ice sheet sitting on top of much of North America, much of Europe, all of Greenland, and then today we're in an interglacial where only Greenland is covered by ice. So we've gone from a glacial to an interglacial period. And during that time, this interglacial is when human civilization has gone from building pyramids 4,500 years ago to the point where we've actually sent satellites into the orbit around the Earth to measure changes in ice mass using laser technology. So we've done a heck of a lot in the last 10,000 years. This is our interglacial. So these glacial interglacial cycles have been going on for hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands to millions of years back through time. So we're in one little unique period where humans have gone crazy. Now, if we jump back to the previous interglacial, so the interglacial that predates the last glacial maximum, what do we know about that? It's a time when data suggests that Earth's average surface temperature was 1 to maybe 1.5 degrees warmer than present. Now, that's really important because that's where we're heading right now. That's the anticipated amount of warming that we'll experience if we achieve the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees. So the last interglacial interval was slightly warmer, not because of CO2 levels, but because of the way the Earth orbits the sun changes, and was slightly more sunlight coming in because of the configuration of the orbits. But it caused our planet to warm up enough that it's an analog for current and future warming. Now, during this time, we know that sea level at its peak was 6 to 9 meters higher than present. It's not sure exactly why, whether most of Greenland melted or some of Antarctica melted, and we're doing quite a lot of work to figure out which ice sheet melted. But the point is, it provides a temperature analog to look at the future. And so we've focused a lot of our science on trying to understand how the oceans responded around the New Zealand region during the last interglacial, stage 5, marine isotope stage 5. You'll hear it referred to as under many different names. Now, how do we find out what the last interglacial was like, or in fact, any past interval of time, what it was like? We use sediment cores and geological outcrop. So this is an example of a sediment core. This panel here is an example of a sediment core that was collected from Antarctica. And we collect these things using ships, some examples of the various vessels that sail around the world, collecting sediment cores from beneath the ocean surface so that we can try to piece together how the ocean system responded, how the ecosystem in those oceans, what it looked like and how it functioned during the past. This sediment core shows an example of, if I was to dig in here and take a sample and look under a microscope, I'd see billions of diatoms. This is a diatomite, a diatom-rich sediment. And then right here at this line here, this is actually transitioning into a glacial sediment. So right at this instant in Earth's past, we went from an interglacial to a glacial. And that's essentially how we can start to look back in time to understand what these previous warm intervals were like. Now, this is an example showing a reconstruction of sea surface temperature during the last interglacial. And so it was done by a colleague of mine at GNS Science, Giuseppe Cortese, and many of his colleagues. And what this map is actually showing is the anomaly, or the temperature anomaly, between what the temperature reconstructions for the last interglacial were compared to today. And so where you see numbers that are 4.9, 3.5 degrees, these are 4.9 to 3.5 degrees warmer than present during the last interglacial. These areas here are actually temperatures, sea surface temperatures that were colder during the last interglacial than present. But you get a general sense that during the last interglacial, average Earth's surface temperatures 1 to 1.5, Paris-type temperatures, the ocean around New Zealand was much warmer than today. So perhaps this is giving us some insight as to what we might expect the oceans to do in the future. What I've done here in this plot is actually taken those temperatures from that last interglacial reconstruction and plotted them on top of a snapshot of a marine heat wave we had in 2019. So these are data from NOAA, showing that a lot of warming along East Australia, out towards New Zealand and around the Chatham Rise, and some cooling north and south. And these temperatures are from that last interglacial reconstruction, showing that the general pattern of warming is very similar. We actually see a bit more cooling in the last interglacial, some cooling up here that's captured in the heat wave. So perhaps the last interglacial is something similar to what we might expect to see in the coming future as these marine heat waves become the new normal. And once we have these sea surface temperature reconstructions, we can start to look at how primary productivity may have changed. Now, we haven't yet done that for the last interglacial, but we have done some work on the change from the last glacial maximum to present. And so we're looking now at the changes in productivity, phytoplankton, primary productivity and zooplankton from offshore New Zealand using models. And so what we're seeing here in this panel is a model simulation using an Earth system model of intermediate complexity, the UVIC model, and it has modules in it that simulate zooplankton, phytoplankton, and diazotrophs. So productivity in the oceans can be simulated. And what we've done is run a simulation for the last glacial maximum and a simulation for pre-industrial conditions, and then looked at the anomalies, the difference between the two. And where you see blue colors, it's showing us that productivity today is much higher than it was 20,000 years ago, and in reds, productivity is much lower than it was 20,000 years ago. So this is a model output. But the really cool thing is we can then look at sediment cores, and here's a couple of sediment cores at location A and B in this higher and lower productivity areas. And these are some of the data in these panels here, A and B, for those sediment cores. And what you can see is that, in fact, in the past, as you came out of the glacial maximum, productivity was lower and it's increased to today. So it's matching what the models are predicting. And same in the north, higher productivity in the glacial maximum and dropping down into modern. So the data in the model, when you compare them, are showing similar outputs, which is really cool. It gives us confidence that the models are actually capturing reality, I guess. So we can now use these sorts of models to look at what might happen as the ocean warms. Now, just to finish up quickly, because I'm running out of time, the other really interesting thing I think that we can tell from using fossils and past intervals of warmth comes from looking at macrofossils. These are examples of shells that were recovered from a deposit up in the Hokianga. Now, what's important about these shells is that today they don't live in New Zealand. Here's their modern distribution. Most of these organisms live along the eastern margin of Australia. They don't live in New Zealand. But when you come to the Hokianga and you find them in the shell deposit, then obviously it's suggesting that at some point in the past, conditions were right that they could migrate from Australia across to New Zealand. And it just so happens that these deposits are from the last interglacial and the interglacial before that. So interglacials that were slightly warmer than present, you start to see these species migrating across from Australia, perhaps on those warmer currents that we know are occurring from the sea surface temperature reconstruction. Now I am going to finish up. Sorry, Elizabeth, I'm going to keep going just because this is super cool. We've been doing quite a lot of work at looking at freshwater flux into the ocean, and I draw your attention to this paper here, published in Nature last year. I would encourage you all to read it because it shows what happens to global temperatures as meltwater is incorporated into these global circulation models. Most of the GCMs haven't yet incorporated freshwater flux, and as we start to include freshwater flux into the models, it's actually changing the climate in the atmosphere. So the oceans, I mean, I think most of you know this, but the oceans matter. And this is just to give you a little taster. This is a regional ocean model that Stefan Yendesi has been using as part of this NZ Sea Rise program, working at Victoria University to simulate the ocean temperature change around New Zealand under RCP 8.5 with that freshwater flux. So these are paleo-proven models. Now we're projecting into the future. And again, you're seeing fairly major warming up to 5 degrees around New Zealand compared to present under these projections. But also what's super interesting is that we can start to look at temperature change with depth. And what you see is as the temperatures in the surface warm, just below those surface warmings, you get a cooling and then a slight warming. And by 2100, you've got warm surface waters, cold waters sitting below that, and warm waters below that. So we can start to perhaps inform some of the people interested in fisheries, fish migration, as to what might happen to ocean temperature structure into the future. So thanks very much for listening.
Her research interests include reviewing impacts of climate change on the seafood sector and developing tools to help New Zealand ocean ecosystems. On Twitter, Carolyn describes herself as a boundary object in a state of flux. Carolyn's focus today, impacts and implications of climate change on marine species. Kia ora, Carolyn.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you. Hopefully you can give a nod if my screen is showing up now. Yes. Cool. Ko Carolyn Lundquist aho, he kai matai putayo na NIWA aho. Welcome everyone. I have the lovely opportunity to introduce you to then what, following on Richard's talk on then what do all these climate changes in the ocean mean for marine biodiversity. And so I've put a few of my own photos up here and some colleagues, but just to emphasize Richard's point just a moment ago that the ocean is really important, and particularly in New Zealand, there we are, tiny little New Zealand, you know, right now, I think leading the world, many people think, in terms of our response to COVID-19, but we are an ocean nation. Our EEZ is quite large. It's over 4 million kilometers squared, and we do range over about 30 degrees of latitude. So that means we do have subtropical environments and subantarctic environments just in our own waters, and we have very shallow waters to very deep waters over 10,000 meters deep in these fancy trenches. So that means the biodiversity that you can find in New Zealand's oceans are huge. We do have our subtropical coral reefs. Just in some of the photos in here, you can also see some hydrothermal vents. We do have hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. We have fjords. We have mangroves. If you're in northern New Zealand, some people aren't actually always that happy about that, but we have our mangroves, our salt marsh, our sand dunes, kelp forests. So there's just such a huge and wonderful diversity of the different environments, the different marine habitats and ecosystems that we find in New Zealand. And just some numbers to throw out at you of what we do have. We have over 60,000 known marine species, but probably 4 times larger than that of species that haven't yet been named or collected. And possibly up to 80% of New Zealand's biodiversity comes from our oceans. We're a hot spot. There have been reports I know that WWF has done. And so we're a hot spot for quite a few different taxa. And we have lots of endemic species, so basically species that are only found in New Zealand. So it makes it quite exciting to know what's going on, but that also makes it very difficult when we're looking at the effects of climate change, because if you were looking at a lot of Richard's photos, we see often differences in what's going to happen, whether it's temperature or productivity or water circulation, depending on whether you're in those very northern subtropical areas of New Zealand's oceans or the subantarctic parts of the ocean. So we do see a whole bunch of differences on what might happen in these predictions as well as what has happened. And so I'm going to pop up some information. We've recently just completed a review for the Ministry of Primary Industries for Fisheries New Zealand that should be coming out online hopefully quite shortly. I've put the reference down there if anyone's interested, but it's basically updating what information we know about climate change in our oceans, but also putting this in this particular report, what does that mean for our fishery sector? And so Richard presented a lot of information about temperature. So we know temperature has increased. So you can see that picture on that bottom left with the diagrams where we're getting a lot more of those black bars that are the warmer years. This is actually about 10 years old in this photo. So we're missing quite a few more warm years that have happened in recent years. And most of you will know that we've had quite a few heat waves. It's great to go out in summer and have nice warmer water, or even in winter to have slightly warmer water, but it isn't necessarily what our biodiversity is used to. And so we do tend to see temperature as one of those much more widely recognized stressors on the oceans. So for example, we've had a couple of these big summer heat waves in 2018, 2019, and the year before. And so what happens when we get these warm water events? Well, some things happen quite close inshore. So I've got a couple pictures there, a couple animals that one you might be familiar with in the middle is the New Zealand cockle. But the other one right next to it is a heart urchin, which is a really common animal in kind of shallow depths from about 2 to about 200 meters depth. And when you find them inshore and the tide goes out on a nice summer day and it's very warm, I don't know if you can see in the background of this photo, there are a whole bunch of dead shells on the surface. And we've seen a number of these mass mortality events on warm water summer days when the tides are exposed, both of these sea urchins as well as of New Zealand cockles. Some of the other things we expect to see happening from these changes in temperatures is there expectations that we might see southward expansion or extension of species ranges. So you might have seen in the newspapers this summer of Otago fishermen reporting catches of snapper. So things like that aren't necessarily unexpected. And then, as Richard was pointing out, we may have some of those subtropical beasties coming down from the Tasman Sea. So we do have this southward potential expansion or migration, but we also see some animals, and this has been seen by our Australian colleagues as well, where they actually drop down out of surface waters. And this might be what's happening with hoki in these summer heat waves, where hoki go down to deeper water. We see those high temperatures really will hit from the surface down to 20 to 40 meters depth. And hoki like it a bit colder, so they may be moving a bit deeper, and so they might not be where the fishermen are expecting to find them. And then, as Richard also pointed out, we do see declines in a lot of the habitat-forming species like our kelps, and this has been a big problem in Tasmania as well as in California and another number of other places around the world where we see temperature declines. So just making sure that we know what's going on and making sure that we're monitoring our kelps to know so that we can respond and be aware if they are declining. Sea level rise, what does that actually mean for marine biodiversity? Well, we know what it means for people, and these are just some king tide photos, and you're probably familiar with seeing a lot of these maps that have these little hockey sticks going up. But we know there are a bunch of different potential predictions depending on exactly how the world goes. Everyone is very familiar with scenarios now with COVID-19, but we do very similar things with climate change on if we do such and such with both how we treat changes in industry and things that result in changes in how much carbon is released into the atmosphere. Those affect what sea level rise will be. But when we look at sea level rise, one of the key things we're worried about then is in coastal erosions. So a lot of New Zealand's most endangered marine habitats, many of them are on the coast, are coastal sand dunes and salt marshes. So this is quite common, particularly on the west coast, and with that combination of changes in winds and waves, and I'll show you a predictive model of wind and wave changes as well, but winds and waves plus sea level rise, we're expecting this to have very large impacts on that coastal erosion, particularly on the west coast of New Zealand. Now, sea level rise itself is quite complicated. In New Zealand, we all know we're a very tectonic nation, and so this means we also have a lot of changes in how much of our country is actually going up itself or going down, so that coastal subsidence. And so you can see in combination with sea level rise and how the landmass itself is moving, we actually see quite differences across the country in what we call a relative sea level rise. So how much actual sea level rise is going on, which is slightly different to kind of the oceanic or global average. So we do see those local variations. And then here's, as promised, this picture of winds and waves. Basically, the red bits mean places in the world where we're expecting much higher rates of waves and winds. And particularly for those of us in New Zealand that do like to go out on the ocean and experience the ocean, this does have a big impact on our ability to go out in the ocean on boats, on surfing, on these high waves and things of that sort. So what else does that affect? Well, one thing that comes out with changes in rainfall or precipitation is we know we have a lot of sediment coming in from land in New Zealand. So most of you have probably seen something like this where we have these sediment plumes coming off from land. And what you can see on the top right there is that's what happens when the sediment comes in and lands in an estuary. So that was actually a cockle bed that's underneath there. And we have smothering of the cockle beds. We have the waters becoming more turbid. So this is, for coastal environments, probably one of our much larger impacts that we're expecting due to our changes from climate change and that change in rainfall. And that obviously also varies around the country, depending on geology and land cover and use and other things that influence how much sediment is available and likely to flow when the rain goes. Now, I like to do a bit of work on mangroves, and so one question we look at with climate change is what's going to happen with our mangroves with climate change. And mangroves, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, we do just have one species in New Zealand, but they're found in a rather restricted kind of part of the marine environment, right at that upper end of the tidal zone. And so the question is, if sea level is going up, then are the mangroves actually going to move up with it? But also we know in New Zealand, we have a lot of extra sediment coming in, and mangroves like that. So over the last 50 or 100 years, we've actually seen quite rapid expansion, and on average, over 3% a year in an increase in mangrove distributions in our 4 northern regions of New Zealand. So the question is, if we run a whole bunch of these models, Richard would have introduced briefly some of these types of scenarios that we use, we can look at what effect we expect that to happen for mangroves. So will we have increases in mangrove distributions, or will we have decreases? And it certainly varies based on the climate model, but it also varies based on what we do on land. So in terms of our different things that we can do to preserve land and remove those sediment impacts that are coming in. Ocean acidification is another thing many people might have heard of, and I recently heard this described as the osteoporosis of the sea. That, I think, describes it quite well. But we know we've had increases in acidity in some of the monitoring that's been done for pH of about 7% in the last about 20 years. And this is basically a big risk for our calcifying organisms. So basically the things that have the hard bits are corals, sponges, sea urchins, all the mollusks, crabs, lobsters, but also a lot of our algae, so our coralline and our crustose forms of algae. And in particular, it's quite a big risk to our deep sea corals. So New Zealand has a huge diversity of deep sea corals, and basically the depth where aragonite, which is what a lot of these are formed of, the depth where it dissolves with climate change is actually becoming shallower, making it more risky and more likely that they'll have trouble forming their hard bits. Oceanic circulation patterns, I think Richard did quite a bit of discussion of this, so I'll only briefly mention it, but we do have that possibility of subtropical species making their way into New Zealand, and you often in warm water years will see records of fishermen catching unusual fish. But then we have bigger issues when we're looking at the entire food chain. So what's happening with our food supply, with primary productivity, with phytoplankton biomass, and there are potentially very large changes that might happen because of changes in ocean stratification and how mixing occurs between the shallow and the deep oceans. We've done, had quite a bit of effort spent looking at what do we actually know for fishes, and I'm just about done here. Looking at about 32 species that we've looked at in detail to see what information we do have. So for example, I've highlighted snapper here and hoki, which are 2 very important fisheries in New Zealand. But basically, if you look at my little legend there, the Y means we actually have evidence something will happen. The green N is evidence that there won't be something that happened. And that little squiggly bit that's in yellow is where people actually, the experts tell us that they're pretty sure something's going to happen, but we don't have any evidence yet. And then there are quite a few that we have the question mark, where we actually have no information whatsoever to know whether something will be impactful or not due to climate change on these particular species. So I think the key thing to pull out of it is we have a huge paucity of information. We have a lot of things we think, either because we know how species work from the experts, or we know what's happened to species in other parts of the world. So we are pretty sure something is going to happen, but quite often we don't actually have the information to definitively say yes or no that it will be an impact. And temperature and ocean acidification are probably the 2 things that we know the best about, but again, not that much. And so I think leading into Huhana's talk with fisheries and with coastal habitats more generally, a lot of it is working with the people who use or are interested in those habitats, whether it's biodiversity or the resources that they get out of them. And in this case, we've done some climate adaptation strategies here for fisheries, looking at what are the vulnerabilities of the species and seeing if we can help to then develop management strategies and options that, in this case, will better prepare that fishery for the future, identify the gaps that we don't know, and then help the fishery to be more able to cope with climate change in the future. So that's me. Thank you very much from my bubble or ex-bubble to all of yours. And I'll hand back to Elisabeth.
Kia ora, Carolyn. That was great from your bubble. I'm really enjoying how these talks are dovetailing into each other. And do please know that you can put your questions in the little box at the bottom there. So our third speaker today, Professor Huhana Smith, is a visual artist, curator, and transdisciplinary researcher. She is a co-principal investigator for research that combines Mātauranga Māori with science to actively address climate change concerns for coastal Māori lands and Horowhenua kapiti. Huhana actively encourages the use of art and design's visual systems combined in exhibitions, the use of art, or to expand how solutions might integrate complex issues and make those solutions more accessible for local communities. Kia ora, Huhana.
O tēnā rau koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. O ngā mihi mahana anō ki a koutou katoa e koikoi ana I konei. Today, thank you very much to both Carolyn and to Richard. I'm just going to briefly talk about the importance of whakakotahitanga. I'm going to talk about the exhibitions very briefly, not all of them. I'll just show you what I can within the time frame. I'm very willing to share this presentation with others if you request it. So you can request it either through Elisabeth or through myself. And so you've got more time to look at it in your leisure. But of great importance, no Ngāti Tū Ahau. I'm from Ngāti Tū on my mother's side. I take home and my wā kāinga and my hau kāinga very seriously, because as we've had from the previous speakers, we have impacts of oceans with climate change impacts, we've had impacts on marine, and then we're having those terrestrial, those relationships between Papa Atawhai and Tangaroa coming closer together. We have more interrelationships happening between water, subsurface and surface water. So what we try to do as hapu-led innovative research projects is that we have been thankfully supported by Deep South. We're moving into our third phase now, but what we've tried to do is apply innovative approaches where we bring Māori culture, we bring mātauranga Māori, so that's Māori knowledge systems, we bring environmental research, we bring nature, art, design, climate change scientists, museum curatorship, exhibitions as site-based research methods, and alternative regenerative economies together. Now you might think that seems impossible, but it can be done. In the time of us doing our Deep South project, we've had 3 phases. So we've done Deep South phase 1 adaptation strategies with a range of people, landscape architects, designers. We've had my cousins Moira and Aroha. We've worked closely as a team for many years now to bring the tikanga or the Māori side of things forward. And then we've had the collaborative participatory research, integrative social wellbeing, fluvial geomorphology and groundwater expertise come together as well. We've also had a master's architecture student working with us as well over time. This is important. I said to you before the importance of haukaunga. It's not just the whenua, it's not just the awa, it's also the expressions of mana, of how Māori see themselves. So our meeting house, Ngāti Tū in Kuku Horowhenua, which is between Levy and Otaki. Just very quickly for you, some ways that we see our research, and our research is underpinned by the knowledge of ancestors, but also the knowledge of kaumātua who've been that close connection to another world and way of seeing themselves in close relationship to nature. So very much this, I think I'll just keep moving on from this because we've got a lot to get through. But if I said 2 important things of our research is that we focus philosophically on interrelationships. Māori knowledge systems is all about how things work together, and we focus on the interdependencies that are within that information as well. And I'll talk a few more about the methods as we move on. But this is the area that we deal with. So my Māori research teams and the other teams that I work with other experts, this is the area between the Oho and the Waikawa River in Horowhenua, and we're just kind of edging to the edge of Waikawa, so between Oho and Waikawa. The star is where our Tūkorehe meeting house is. So this is significant ancestral landscape, which is of great importance to iwi and hapu, and how much we want to protect it from the impacts of climate change. So I mentioned before 2 research projects, adaptation strategies, risk assessments we just finished last year. All of these are available online. And then we've got the Deep South Phase 3, which is caring for the taonga that have been passed on by our ancestors, and we're looking at action-oriented climate change transitions to water-based land uses that might enhance taonga species. I'll just move on from that slide. This is also, just before I do, we're also showing you some of the key areas that we've been working on since 2010. So this is just, these are not just recent projects, they've been built upon previous research projects. Kuku Orsa Estuary, this is what we look like in the relationship between the sea and the land. I'm going to just talk quickly about an innovative way that has become a way of practice for our teams. I talked before about landscape architecture. I talked before about tikanga Māori and Māori knowledge systems, and then I talk about the ecological economics coming together. We've done exhibitions in spaces, on places which are Māori-owned land, in a former dairy shed, and we had a big exhibition about climate change. Now, we as people in an area that we know and love, and that it is an expression of our identity, it's very frightening, and it's also very daunting, just the level of information. As Richard and Carolyn have shown so clearly, there is so much that you need to know about this space. So we somehow try and bring people together to show them what are the things that they need to know and understand, and then also have that created within a Māori lens. So these are vision statements from Māori for how we want to see things in our area. That's like creating flourishing land again. So having our farms, our coastal Māori farms, look after their whenua and their waterways really well. Tiakitanga, like caring and protecting for our coastal estuaries. This was an exhibition that focused on a dairy shed and 3 sheds in that dairy shed complex. This shed was the whakapapa shed, the oldest shed. So it showed us the coastal estuary and then Māori knowledge systems around estuaries, moons, tides, local knowledge of place of importance to Māori, and then also the vision statements. We had another shed we called the hikoi shed, because in one of our research methods, we walk and talk the whenua a lot. So we've been walking and talking this whenua in earnest since 1995, but more so with funded research and with many more people since 2009. So the hikoi shed showed us the climate change levels. So our estuary changing, our Kuku Oha estuary changing quite dramatically. And just to show you what that might look like, big banners showing us what 0.5 metre sea level rise looks like at present, and then showing this gradation stages, which perhaps spans 100 years. So the potential of this area in Aotearoa, which links up with every other area in Aotearoa, having issues in regards to where water is not only going to lie, it's not to say this we're going to get a big blue lake, it does mean we are going to be wetter, and that means our surface water and our subsurface water are meeting more, we're flooding more, we've got more coastal erosion, as the other speakers have put forward. So in all of this kind of difficult and complex information, what are the solutions that we can put forward to make it easier for ourselves to see ourselves as part of the solution? So senior landscape architect students creating projects around water, creating projects around sustainable papakainga, creating projects around harakeke. So very quickly, I'm an artist, so I paint paintings when I get a chance, but this was an installation that I painted before I created the installation, and it was very much about returning industry to areas that were renowned for their harakeke. Our people grew, harvested harakeke for a burgeoning Wellington. We harvested harakeke in the late 1820s, 1830s, and returning to a renewed economy where we're looking at customary knowledge and harakeke as a important vital plant that could create a new economy in a sustainable fabric industry. So these are some of the things that we've put together over the years, joining those different knowledge bases together. The other thing about the shed exhibition was whakapapa. hikoi, and kōrero tuku iho, which is the oral narratives of place. So knowing our place, knowing our Māori relationships to this place, and being able to use that as the platform upon which to build solutions or analyse the what-if scenarios. What if you see more flooding? What will you do about it? What if you see more coastal erosion? What will you do about it? So this shed in particular, the kōrero tuku iho, was about, these were the what-if scenarios, and then what in the illuminated panels in the back, illuminated by LED lights, what were the solutions? Just moving on. So many things in bringing together, but adaptation strategies, risk assessments, practical projects for people to kind of do. You can see here that we're trying hard in the third phase of our research is to implement some of these things that we've been talking about. We can manifest ideas about this, but we have to implement because we are really needing to be in action phase. So it's just some of the crew who came to our exhibition in March 2017. Uanuku, Māori always have a very spiritual world, so when you get a rainbow that's emanating off the ground at the time of this exhibition, it was a fairly auspicious tohu or reminder that maybe we were doing something okay, but that we had a big job to do and perhaps we needed a bit of ancestral support. So this was a very spiritual moment for everyone who was present at that hui, and spontaneous karakia going up at that time. I just flipped quickly to 2019. I didn't show you, we took that exhibition out of the dairy shed and we put it in an art gallery, put it in the museum, in the Dowse Art Museum in Lower Hutt, and re-exemplified it for another audience, which worked really well too. But just moving into the last phases of this kōrero, ngā mahi no anai nei hei oranga mo apopo, which is really all about everything we do today has to benefit our future our generations tomorrow. So we did another exhibition in Otaki. This one was more about the risk assessments. Again, just finalising, finessing some of the things that we'd raised. And it was so beautifully raised by Carolyn and Richard about the impacts that humans have done. But what can we do as a community to kind of understand those impacts and then look forward towards the solutions? So this, again, some of the detail of coastal inundation. And then what we might do, so we had that, this is now, and when we have flooding kind of, oh, sorry, yeah, this, I'll move to the second one. This is the transition action phase that we need to put in place now. So this was done in 2019, so we need to do this now. So it's revegetating, regrowing the Oho River Loop area, extending the wetlands, planting out the coastal areas in Harakeke, returning native vegetation, making a strong coastal buffer. This is what transition phase 2 looks like now in the next 30 years. So you can see that we have to adapt to the water. I just want to show this one too, just for this is for erosion control, and this was a young architect, a master's student from Victoria University, who was making erosion control methods. And then finally, I just want to leave you with, while I didn't talk deeply about the Harakeke sustainable fabric industry, I can at a later date, but just showing you some of that customary and contemporary kind of interface, contemporary artist, showing his panels at the back there at the Otaki Māori Film Festival, and then our contemporary but customary makers of our whatiraranga or our weavers being able to create beautiful objects of that are manifest from Harakeke. But our process for Harakeke will be much more about a sustainable fabric industry as a new economy. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much, everyone. Namahi aroha anō.
Kia ora, Huhana. One of the drawbacks of Zoom, I think, is that we can't see the people in the audience's eyes lighting up, as I know they were then. And there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be asking for more information about what you're doing. So thank you so much. I also really enjoy the marriage of art and science, so often seen as polar opposites, and you've got them mingling, and beautiful. Okay, so question time. As usual, we are short on time. To paraphrase one of the questions, I won't be naming the people asking the questions because this is going on YouTube and we haven't sought permission for you to be named. But this one is for Richard. Other than observing productivity patterns, what other relationships could marine microorganisms have with climate change? E.g., could they play a role in absorption of carbon dioxide?
Yes, that's a big question. So I mean, I guess part of the thing, a couple of things we're interested in is, and working with our colleagues at NIWA and universities around New Zealand, is to try to understand the impact on the food web as the phytoplankton change. And Carolyn alluded to this, it's a rather complex problem. We've been trying to figure out whether or not we can look at things like cell size variation. If the organisms under a warmer climate from the past, actually the populations got smaller in size, so the cell sizes themselves get smaller, that can actually impact the feeding structure in a food web. So there's the potential for shifts in the population size of the phytoplankton to have a major impact. But trying to understand all these relationships is incredibly complex, and again, our colleagues at NIWA have been working on this for a long time. It's not a straightforward thing to address. In terms of carbon capture and sequestering CO2, absolutely, we know that from the past, that when you get large blooms of phytoplankton in particular, as they sink to the ocean floor, they can actually capture and sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it is something that people have looked at in the past, even to fertilize the oceans to try to get these organisms to bloom. I know that's not in vogue at the moment. There are a whole bunch of other things you don't want to have happen if you do that. So geoengineering is a bit risky, but certainly naturally in the past we know that carbon has been pulled out of the system and sequestered and captured in the seafloor, through natural cycles of phytoplankton bloom. I don't know if Carolyn wants to add to that. I suspect she might.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it more than I could.
Okay.
And
really
this,
complex.
in 7 minutes or less. This was also a paraphrased question, and possibly Carolyn or Richard. Is it possible to quantify in economic terms the benefit of COVID for our planet? Presumably the stopping rather than COVID itself.
I saw that question and I thought, wow, that's going to be a question that many people are going to ask, right? I mean, I think the question is, can we quantify the cost of essentially a shutdown and the consequences and reduction of CO2? And I was just reading a paper before coming onto this webinar. It's just come out in Nature Climate Change today, showing that we've had a 17% reduction in fossil fuel carbon dioxide production as a result of COVID. Now that's had a massive economic cost. So I imagine there'll be economists, there'll be climate change scientists taking these data and trying to model into the future what it would take to try to keep those levels low while building our global economies. This is going to be a massive area of research, I suspect, with lots of great data to utilize now, which is pretty exciting, but certainly nothing I'll be involved in directly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And a question for Huhana. Are there processes in place as part of your project to plan for recording and or protecting archaeological sites threatened by coastal erosion and sea level rise?
It's a great question. Thank you. Yes, we have already mapped our cultural significance and archaeological areas. We do know where they are because that's all part of the kōrero tuku iho, or the knowledge of place. So the unfortunate thing about that is that not all the land I showed you is owned by Māori. So the Kuku estuary is owned by Māori, the coast is owned by Māori, but across the river it's owned by somebody else. And a big, an important block of land there has quite significant archaeological areas. And we need to work with the new person who's bought it, who's a developer. So we're just going to have to see and work closely with that person in order to enable iwi-based protection plans to be put into place, to actually really listen to those protection plans, because we've been saying it a lot for that whole coastline, that we need to step away from the coastline and protect some more, which means we need to protect our archaeological or our wahitapu or our wahi tupuna or our battle sites, all those areas. We as tūkorehen know where they are, and that we actively work to put protection mechanisms in place. So,
thank you. That's probably all we have time for today. Unfortunately, these hours fly by. Thank you so much to our three speakers, Carolyn, Richard, and Huhana. My head is exploding, and Remember too that this dialogue is ongoing and it doesn't end at 4:30, and it's vital that we use these discussions as a tool for change. So do please join us next week, same time, same channel, same Eventbrite booking system, for a panel event featuring a diverse group of speakers who will discuss the impacts of climate change on the marine environment, including Leanna Baraball, Dr. Libby Liggins, Kirsty Woods, Joran Jongians, and Carl Waugh. And thank you so much for joining us today. If you've got any other thoughts or queries, if you want copies of the speakers' talks, please email marine@doc.gov.nz. Ka kite anō te whānau. And to close our session today, I'll pass back to Huhana for a karakia.
Unuhia, unuhia, unahia te urutapu nui. Kia wātea, kia māmā, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takatā. Koia rā e rongo, whakairea ake ki runga, kia tīna, tīna, hui e, tae ki e.